Buenas noches, bienvenidas, bienvenidos a Casa Árabe, a esta que es nuestra séptima sesión de Aula Árabe Universitaria. Also, if you want to use the headphones. Vale. Bueno, pues en esta ocasión, además, como sabéis, el acuerdo de Casa Árabe para hacer esta serie de conferencias es justamente involucrar a las universidades y bueno, pues nos da un enorme gusto poder esta tarde compartir esta sesión con dos másters en concreto, el máster en Democracia y Gobierno y el máster Erasmus Mundus EUROSUD-South European Studies de la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Entonces, bienvenidos a todos y todas que sean parte de estos másters. Realmente la idea de esta colaboración de Casa Árabe con los másters universitarios de las universidades madrileñas es no solo acercarnos a vosotros como estudiantes, sino que también los propios intereses de los másters de estudios universitarios puedan incorporarse a la programación de Casa Árabe, que como sabéis, pues tratamos con frecuencia de analizar la coyuntura internacional y en concreto en lo que atañe a esta casa, que es los países árabes y desde luego su interacción con otras partes del mundo. Y en este caso vamos a hablar hoy de esta relación muy peculiar, transatlántica, tanto del papel de Washington como el de Bruselas, asumiendo que Bruselas es una unidad, y de lo cual seguramente nos va a hablar el profesor Oz Hassan. Desde luego, promover la democracia en una región como Oriente Medio suena a una idea estupenda, algo que también, sin duda, los pueblos abrazarían con entusiasmo, ¿no? Y hemos visto manifestaciones desde, vamos a decir, 2011 en concreto, que han querido un cambio social, en principio, hacia una apertura más democrática en la región. Sin embargo, hemos visto también las contrarrevoluciones, los movimientos contrarrevolucionarios y cómo ha habido una serie de alianzas para también apagar estas corrientes que buscaban cambios sociales y políticos. Y lo que es importante es tomar en cuenta siempre el contexto, ¿no?, en el que se dan estos movimientos y también de quién y cómo se pretende promover la democracia. Y creo que aquí es donde lo que viene a traernos hoy Oz Hassan nos puede realmente ilustrar lo complicado que puede ser perseguir una agenda de promover la democracia en países de Oriente Medio y al mismo tiempo tratar de compaginar eso con los intereses de Estados Unidos y la Unión Europea, o por lo menos algunos miembros de lo que llamamos la Unión Europea. Pensemos en lo que siempre al final, digamos, es muy recurrente al analizar la situación actual de Oriente Medio, y es la invasión en 2003 liderada por Estados Unidos en Irak, y cómo eso determina una serie de desenlaces complejos, desde luego, pero con unos resultados en principio negativos, ¿no? Esa llamada de George W. Bush a ganar los corazones y mentes de los iraquíes justo después de haber lanzado una campaña que se llamaba Shock and Awe, o sea, conmoción y pavor, no deja de ser, pues desde luego, bastante contradictoria, ¿no? Cómo ganar esos corazones y esas mentes a través de unas elecciones en un país que quizás no estaba listo para efectuar elecciones y para cambiar completamente su sistema político. Y tenemos hoy el Irak que tenemos, ¿no? En cualquier caso, en estas últimas 2 décadas hemos visto estas transformaciones en Oriente Medio y una arquitectura regional cada vez más complicada, países en el Golfo que han asumido papeles que no tenían antes y, desde luego, cómo van a reaccionar Washington y Bruselas a este digamos, doble intento de reconciliar, por un lado, su agenda de promoción de la democracia y, por el otro, sus intereses y la estabilidad en la región. Me gustaría pues aprovechar, ya que mencioné a los másters en Democracia y Gobierno y Erasmus Mundus y esta colaboración con la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, pues mencionar que también nos acompaña hoy Ignacio Molina, profesor de Ciencia, Política y Relaciones Internacionales en la Autónoma. Muchas gracias, Ignacio, por unirte. Y finalmente, pues presentar a Oz Hassan, que si no habrán visto su currículum en la hoja de sala, aprovecho pues para aclarar quién es. Hemos colaborado, de hecho, antes Casa Árabe con él, no ha podido estar presente físicamente aquí, pero sí, desde luego, nos ha mandado un paper que publicamos en nuestra revista Aurac hace ya unos años. Él es profesor asociado en el Departamento de Política y Estudios Internacionales de la Universidad de Warwick, en Reino Unido, y está finalizando actualmente un trabajo sobre intereses transatlánticos y posibilidad democrática en un Oriente Medio en transformación. Ha sido investigador visitante en el programa Democracia y Estado de Derecho del Carnegie Endowment for International Peace en Washington y es autor de un libro que se llama Constructing America's Freedom Agenda for the Middle East. También ha publicado múltiples revistas de relaciones internacionales sobre esta relación entre Estados Unidos y Oriente Medio. Sin más, vamos a cederle la palabra, al final de la cual pues tanto Ignacio y yo le haremos unas preguntas y luego abriremos el turno de preguntas a vosotros para que vayáis apuntando de una vez vuestras dudas y preguntas. Dear Oz, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Well, firstly, thank you to Karim. Thank you, Ignacio, for having me here today. I'm conscious that I've got a translator, so I'm going to try and talk a little bit slower than I normally would. And I'm also sort of dealing with this. So let me just sort of move on from here so I don't get an echo in my ear. So when we sort of talk about democracy promotion, it's important to begin to think about how that started, especially with transatlantic democracy, because it really begins to tell us something about what that actually means. You know, it's not, democratization, democracy is an essentially contested concept. So it's not obvious necessarily what it means until you analyze how it's being used. So if we start with the European Union really adopts this idea of democracy, human rights, and good governance as part of the 1995 Barcelona process, which became the European Mediterranean Partnership. Today, or rather from 2008, that laid the groundwork for the foundations of the Union for the Mediterranean, which was part of the relaunch cooperation campaign in 2008. But the important part of those is that we need to understand that what they do is they don't just solely focus on democratization. If anything, democratization is secondary to its sort of the key focus of the European Union's policy in the Mediterranean. So for the EU, the purpose is a sort of political and security basket, which defines a sort of common area of peace and stability through dialogue. And that's quite an important point to sort of make, is that it is through dialogue at this point for the European Union. They're also trying to construct a zone of shared prosperity, and here we're talking about economic partnerships, financial partnerships, and the gradual culmination of a free trade area. And that's the sort of economic and financial basket. And then the third element to the European Union's approach is the social, cultural, and human basket, which really deals with cross-cultural understanding and exchanges between civil society. And so here we can understand that the EU is operating at many different levels and has done really since 1995. Today, what that means is that there's 27 member states now that the United Kingdom has left, and being from Britain, it's quite an awkward thing to actually sort of think or get your head around. But so what you've now got is these sort of 27 member states dealing with 15 southern Mediterranean countries. And of course, only a few of those we would consider sort of North Africa or the Middle East. So we've got Albania falls in there, Algeria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Mauritania, Monaco, Montenegro, Morocco, Palestinian territories, Syria, which has now been suspended, Tunisia, Turkey, and Libya has been an observer since 1999. So that's quite a mixed bunch of countries that I wouldn't necessarily put together, but the European Union sort of has. And in concrete terms, when we talk about democracy promotion, or rather these partnerships, we're not just sort of talking about democracy promotion per se. You can get into some quite obscure or detracted elements of the programming. For example, the Union for the Mediterranean on their website highlights the depollution of the Mediterranean Sea as one of its key sort of strategic goals, one of the sort of programs that's done quite well. You've got new maritime and land highways that connect people and goods. You've got civil protection programs to respond to disasters. You've got alternative energy projects such as the Talifa wind farm in Jordan. And you've also got partnerships between universities and business development initiatives. And I'll begin to sort of talk a bit more about how that leads into some of the thinking around democratization later on. But right now, all I want to sort of say is that for the EU has really been building capacity for cooperation for democracy with an embedded objective, not the objective, an embedded objective, pretty much for a quarter of a century now. And so what the EU has is actually quite technical institutional programming, where it's looking to integrate, it's looking to create dialogues, it's creating a governance-based approach, where the fact that these countries sit within the neighbourhood, within the southern neighbourhood, is incredibly important. Here, for the EU, geography matters because it's part of the reach, if you like. And what some of these programs are trying to do, if you like, is look at these countries, look at these states, and create certain modernization processes. So we've got a sort of, right, if we can create these economic reforms, then these economic reforms will lead to creating a middle class. That middle class will then demand more dignity and other rights, and therefore democratization processes become emergent through social change. At the same time, part of the civil society dialogue is precisely to sort of spread that culture of dialogue that is so important to democracy. The idea that, that civil society is supposed to operate and take control for itself and be organic from the bottom up. So that's sort of the European Union's approach and where it's come from, if you like. Now, the United States, the approach the United States has adopted is different to this. So when we talk about a transatlantic approach, there is overlap, but there certainly aren't the same thing. For the United States, transforming the Middle East was not part of this sort of post-Cold War era idea. When Francis Fukuyama, those of you who do international relations will know, sort of talks about, democracy being the ultimate model that the world is going to move to. Ultimately, the United States doesn't adopt that in the 1990s. In the 1990s, the United States carries on. So it's not part of the original George Bush's New World Order. It doesn't fall under Clinton's democracy programs, et cetera, et cetera. The trigger for the United States, and when the United States decides that democratization is the way forward, is on September the 11th, 2001. Now, what happens with that is originally you get the war in Afghanistan, And as the war in Afghanistan's going on, you get think tanks, people like Bernard Lewis, so academics, getting drawn together with the Department of Defense. And this is around November 2001. And they have a secret meeting that I believe Paul Wolfowitz refers to as the Bletchley II meeting. And in that meeting, they come up with a classified document that still hasn't been released, but people talk about, the contents of it, and they refer to it as the Delta of Terrorism. And the idea is that what you do is, you invade Iraq, you transform Iraq, and from there, down the Delta, you begin to transform the region by creating this model that other states are supposed to replicate. So there's a precise date in which this idea comes about, if you like. But in addition to that, what you get with, I think at the time it was Elizabeth Cheney, who's now a senator, the vice president's daughter, she says, well, okay, you've got this sort of harder side, but you actually need to start creating these sort of longer-term institutions to promote democracy in the region. And that's where you get the Middle East Partnership Initiative, or MEPI. You also get these ideas about the Middle East Free Trade Area, MEFTA, and you also get these sort of other transatlantic approaches or more multilateral approaches of being adopted with the broader Middle East and North Africa agreement, the BMENA. And what they're trying to do, the idea was that these things are going to drain the swamp. Yeah, what they did is they looked at sort of the 2002 Arab Human Development Report and decided, okay, there is clearly a desire for democratization in the region. These programs should try and promulgate that. So between a certain period of time, between sort of, say 2002 through to, I'm going to say 2008, but I'm going to qualify that later on. You've got the George W. Bush administration saying, right, democratization is what we're pushing for, and that actually the region needs to transform. And I'll just read out a quote that pretty much sums up the George W. Bush approach, or the mentality here. 60 years of Western nations excusing and accommodating the lack of freedom in the Middle East did nothing to make us safe, because in the long run, stability cannot be purchased at the expense of liberty. As long as the Middle East remains a place where freedom does not flourish, it will remain a place of stagnation, resentment, and violence ready for export. And here lies the crucial element, the difference between the European Union. Whilst the European Union is looking at this as a geographic issue to do with its own neighbourhood, for the United States, democracy promotion is about the security of the United States. What the George W. Bush administration does, it articulates security and democratization as being part of the same thing. And that's a crucial difference, because what it means is that for the United States is that it's only interested in democracy as long as it secures its own national interests. And this, I think, we can sort of pull into world history. If you look at world history, if you look at what the United States has been doing since the early 20th century, or the late 19th century, really since the Spanish-American War, is you've got a state that is expanding. And what do states do when they expand? When they get more power, they want to push and shove and control. That's part of, neoclassical realist thinking around what states do. Now, for the United States, the ambition since World War II has been to make sure that no regional hegemon arises that can challenge the United States' supremacy within the global order. So, in that sense, security needs to be understood not as a wishy-washy, everyone's going to be happy idealist goal, which is often how those who oppose it are describing it. For the George W. Bush administration, it was just another form of hard realism. It was another national interest to be balanced out with the others. So what you've got for as an organisational concept for the George W. Bush administration was in 2005, you've got the second inaugural address. It formed the basis of the national security strategy in 2006. In 2007, you had the Advanced Democracy Act, and you also had National Security Directive 58, or the executive order, that set in motion a whole range of institutional approaches. So, but, you know, if we sort of delve down into what the United States was doing a little deeper, really what we see is that the harder, sort of more political elements of pushing for democracy really dropped off post-2006. So there was a strong period between 2004 and 2006, but in 2006, what you got was this big pushback. All of a sudden, you started to get Hamas winning in Palestine, and all of a sudden the Bush administration began to bulk and say, actually, we're facing this Islamist dilemma. Democracy, as we've sort of said, isn't quite providing, or pushing for elections, isn't quite providing what we thought it would. But there was a good period, if you like, that the Bush administration sort of pointed to, that they at the time referred to as the Arab Spring, when there were elections in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, there was women's suffrage introduced in Kuwait, you've got reforms in Morocco and Jordan, and you've also got the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon. That was the period where the George W. Bush administration began to sort of take credit for those movements and say, like, look, this is because of our freedom agenda, our programming. But at the same time as it was doing that, it never lost that hard-edgedness. You know, not only did you have sort of the push for democracy in Iraq through force, at the same time you had the Syria democracy program being funded through MEPI and the Iranian democracy program as well. It was effectively funding dissidents to try and overthrow the state. So as part of that, post-2006, the hollowing out meant that once the United States realized that it wasn't going to meet its, or quite turn out how the United States wanted it to turn out, you began to get the United States moving away from pushing for democracy per se and really pushing for economic liberalization. And here, you know, so political reforms went out the door, women's rights went out the door, and economic reforms became the sort of central pillar of democracy. Free trade and free markets, or what we would refer to as the Washington, or then as the Washington Consensus, was really about pushing for economic freedom, again as a way of modernizing, as a way of creating the rule of law, as a way of creating this sort of middle class that will then sort of demand more rights. And here's where we begin to see a sort of lowest common denominator arising between how the European Union and the United States understands how democracy promotion is done. It's their mental model, if you like, that they rely on. It's that actually, if there is a transatlantic approach, it flows from this idea of modernization theory that has come out of development. I think it was Rostow that developed it back in the early 70s. Yeah. I think Rostow was the one who began to implement it, and that's where it got into the United States sort of paradigm, policy network. So what you've got here is this idea of modernization sort of taking place in a very practical way, as in that's how we are going to arrive at this democracy. And so when the Obama administration takes over, what you end up with is Iraq and democracy sort of being conflated, and really sort of, Iraq being referred to as a war of choice, which, I don't think we can disagree with now. You've got the Obama administration sort of, or President Obama doing his Cairo speech where he sort of talks about mutual respect, about trying to engage Iran, namely because the Iranian nuclear issue is seen as more important than democracy in Iran. So, there was a period in time during the sort of green movement back in 2009 where the Obama administration said, well, actually the best thing we can do is leave well alone from this and not engage, not try and push for any sort of democracy there. And again, what the Obama administration did is it again adopted this idea of modernization thesis. It said, right, what we need to do is we need to have modernization, economic development, take part and sort of travel forward. There was a slight shift for the Obama administration because they began to refer to sustainable development as part of that package. So human security, freedom from fear and freedom from want were supposed to be operating together. And this is when we ended up with the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, or the QDDR, which really began to merge development, democracy, security and diplomacy all together to try and get the different organs of American policy to work together on one direction. And in that sense, what's really interesting is by the time you got to 2010, there was the Obama administration began to sort of review what was going on in the Middle East. So there was a political reform in the Middle East memo, if you like. And it basically said this: increased repression could threaten the political and economic stability of our allies, leave us with fewer capable, credible partners who can support our regional priorities, and further alienate citizens in the region. And the conclusion of that report was that what the United States needed was tailored country strategies to promoting democracy or promoting sort of American interests. But of course, what then happened is we had the Arab revolutions. And once the Arab revolutions occur, that's a real crisis for the United States because, of course, no longer does the region look the way in which it has for a large period of time. All of a sudden decisions need to start being made. And the first decision that sort of needed to be made was, does Obama abandon Mubarak? Does he abandon this long-term strategic ally? And the answer that was arrived at was yes. The United States called for Mubarak to step down eventually, not straight away. But of course, at this point, what they've actually done is incredibly upset Saudi Arabia. I mean, apparently the phone calls between Saudi Arabia and the United States were absolutely bitter. And of course, this is the moment that the Saudis decide that the United States is no longer going to provide security for the kingdom in the way in which its security guarantees are supposed to. The question of an existential threat from that revolution comes about. Obviously, then you've got the Libya conflict that erupts. The United States decides to lead from behind there. It allows European powers, or certainly encourages European powers to step forward in NATO, which is why you've got Britain and France operating that way. But again, you think that this absolutely crucial moment where you've got thousands of people on the streets demanding dignity, demanding greater rights, would be the moment that a democracy promotion agenda would really step forth, and the European Union, the United States would embrace this and say, right, this is the moment that we can support. And that's not what happened. What happened was the United States and the EU effectively fell back on this idea of modernization. If you look at the programming that came out of the United States, you've got the Middle East North Africa Trade and Investment Partnership Initiative, MENA-TIP. You've got a special coordinator for the Middle East transitions that was created, that Bill Taylor actually filled. And then you've got the G8 Development Partnership. And really what you began to get was this sort of hollowing out. When the counter-revolution came in Egypt, the American law says that you aren't supposed to give aid to countries that have a coup. But of course, what the Obama administration's response was, well, it's not a coup if we don't say it is. So therefore, if we don't say it is a coup, Congress can authorize the continued funding of what now amounts to around $76 billion in the time of economic aid to Egypt. So, this great moment that we sort of look back on a decade ago, when you actually look at how the US responded, was quite problematic. And for the EU, what's really interesting about the EU is that, the EU really did not step up to the mark. The EU decided that it was going to sort of adopt these sort of incremental changes. It there's this bizarre irony that the EU overestimated its importance in the region before the crises, before the revolutions occurred, and then when they occurred, withdrew and fundamentally sort of acted as if it didn't have any influence at all after. It's a very peculiar game that the EU began to play. So what happened was, at that point, is that member states started to take back greater control of Middle Eastern policy. So at that point, you know, the EU as a sort of global actor wasn't, as a sort of governance, as an actor of security governance, if you like, was inhibited. And I think that's fairly true of pretty much any crisis you look at through history, that the EU, when there is a crisis, member states withdraw powers from the EU. But you know, that's not to say that the EU wasn't doing anything. So you've got the EU engaging with Islamists, you've got quiet diplomacy, you've got the Spring Programme that really focused on some political reforms, you've got financial frameworks through the ENP paradigm, and sort of trying to get that sort of operating. You've got country-specific projects, European instruments for democracy and human rights. They created the European Endowment for Democracy, and they sort of created a sort of action plan for human rights as well. But the problem you've got here, and this is one of the things that over the 10 years since has sort of taught us, is that the EU's response was incredibly technocratic. It introduced bureaucratic complications. So when you were on the ground talking to people who were receiving EU money, there was talk about, well, in large part, they abandoned receiving EU money because it was just painstaking to get it. But at the same time, what you've got is the EU sort of trying to be painstakingly neutral in the way in which they're trying to assist delivery. They never sort of overcome the sort of problems that they were having over their vision and the interests of different partners in the region, if you like. There was conditionality attributed that simply wasn't compatible with the region itself. And so you've got civil society really beginning, in various places, beginning to criticise the EU, not as treating them as strategic equals, but instead trying to subject them to reforms and to technocratic rules as a way of moving forward. And if you look at how the EU responded then, you can really break it down into it trying to sort of deal on the one hand with the symptoms and also at the same time trying to deal with the causes of the revolutions. And that meant that the EU really adopted, if we sort of look at it in the whole, a sort of containment strategy. And this became increasingly clear as it tried to deal with stability in Syria and Iraq. And here we're talking about, the Islamic State, and in particular the problems that the European Union has with that, which is, you've got 2,600 to 3,000 EU citizens, particularly from France and Belgium, UK arrests and things like that, that are going to go back. And having to deal with the time, if we think back to that point in time, it was a real crisis for the EU, and it mismanaged it and didn't really know what to do. Instability in Libya, it was never able to sort of get a grip with. Instability in the Gulf, again, it was never able to sort of get a grip on. And so what you've got, if you look at how the EU operated, it was quite dysfunctional at the time. It wasn't ever able to get traction, especially when if you look at the trilateral relationships that are going on, is that during a crisis, when the United States steps forward to deal with something, it can often marginalize the EU completely, which is, a real shame. So there's cooperation with the EU, but it's always as a secondary partner when the United States considers its own interests sort of being pushed forward. And so if we sort of look at how this has begun to turn out today, sort of moving away from that sort of 10-year period, we begin to see democracy promotion over this time. Instead of becoming, instead of seeing the revolutions as this great moment where the EU and the US have their opportunity to finally institutionalize the policies that they said that they wanted for so long, we begin to see a diminishing of them. That democracy promotion itself is almost now seen as quite quaint. As indeed, talking about human rights is now seen as quite quaint. And in part of that dynamic really falls down to the aftermath of those revolutions and the structures and strains that they have put on the region and tensions that are emerging between the transatlantic partners. So what do I mean by this? Well, internally, you've got Saudi Arabia and Egypt actively trying to counter democracy. You've got an increasingly aggressive role being played by Iran that is now incredibly important to China and China's access to the region through the Belt and Road Initiative. So if we sort of look at the global financial crisis in 2008, that was the key strategic moment that China decided that the United States was no longer able or should be trusted to secure its economic interests, i.e. the United States can't be trusted to actually uphold capitalism in the same way that it used to. So what the Chinese begin to do is develop plans to get increasingly involved in the Middle East as a region. So Iran is fundamental to that, which is where some of the tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia play out to this larger sort of Cold War battle, if you like, that we can see emerging between the United States and China. And at the same time as that, you've also got Russia getting increasingly involved in the region, and all of a sudden, especially in Syria, and sort of all of a sudden you're starting to see this sort of new geopolitical tension where those geopolitical tensions override any interest that the United States has in democracy promotion. At the same time as you've got new technologies being introduced in the region that are actually favourable to authoritarianism. So internally that's quite a mess. But at the same time as we sort of talk about that, we can begin to talk about, Donald Trump and the European Union. Trump's America is actively trying to undermine the European Union. It promotes the destruction of the European Union, the United Kingdom to break away. It's actively moved away from having or supporting the Iranian nuclear program, the JCPOA. And it's also broken the traditional way in which agreements over the sort of transatlantic approach to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict are handled. So, and that's in addition to withdrawing from Syria without actually discussing it with partners in advance. So what you've got with Trump's America First is not just a move away from democratization, but a move away from modernization, move away from an economic free market-based understanding of how democratization occurs, as the United States increasingly begins to put up barriers. But also, more importantly, you have a move away from those values that bonded the European Union and the United States together. And that, I think, is part of the larger picture that is stoking up tensions that mean democracy promotion, whilst for that large period of time before the revolutions it was seen as the key strategic interest of the United States is now fundamentally dead, to the point in which it's very difficult to see for another generation where it will come about again. I think that's my 30 minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Hassan. It's really very, very interesting presentation. Let me first give my regards to the students from Democracy and Government MA and also South European Studies EUROSUD students. So very welcome and thank you very much, Casa Árabe, for having together with the rest of the public in this so interesting discussion. I really like your. I mean, when you have tried to explain the. Now, my first question deals with the U.S. Foreign policy and democratization. No? If we may think that, well, if we have two extreme opposite explanation, that stereotype explanation about why the American foreign policy has tried to democratize Middle East. On the one hand, we have the idealistic Wilsonian approach that the United States is basically the city on the hill, and they have this idea, somewhat naive, that they have to promote democracy, they have to promote international peace. So this is one explanation, and I very much agree that this is a very naive way to explain. But on the other hand, the other extreme, we have the absolutely opposite explanation. That actually, the U.S. didn't have an agenda for democratization or a hidden agenda of taking advantage of a narrative of democratization, but in fact, the idea was to control oil, to revenge Kuwait war. But I really think that your explanation to say, well, it's absolutely linked to national security concerns, but there was a real democratization agenda. Was not, Washington really meant it when they decided that in the case of the Iraq war, that they wanted to create a democracy in the middle of Middle East and with the Iraq war, because that was very good for the national interest of the United States. Not because of idealism, not because of Wilsonian foreign policy, was actually a neoconservative way, but at the same time was honest, because they really thought that was the best for the American interest. And my question is, because you have mentioned modernization theory, which is really, really interesting. So the idea that if you have a modern civil society, you have a free market, you are going to create stability, rule of law. But you haven't mentioned democratic peace theory. This is the idea that democracies are very hesitant to have a war one each other. No? And when you think in the 20th century, for the U.S., the most important challenge before the Cold War, before the Soviet Union, were Germany and Japan. Very obvious, Germany and Japan in the Second World War. And in Germany and Japan, the U.S., the American foreign policy, didn't implement modernization theory. Why? Because Germany and Japan were already modern. I mean, the Meiji Revolution in Japan, or Germany was already a modern country. They explicitly used, at least as a justification for promoting the German constitution, the Japanese constitution, the idea of democratic peace. If we have a democracy in Japan, if we have a democracy in Germany, we are not going to have more war in Western Europe or on Eastern Asia, because the two most important powers in the regions have become democracy, and was very successful. Very successful. I mean, Germany became a democracy, Japan became a democracy. My point is, when you have also mentioned the decision and the discussion in the George Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, and the Department of State and Department of Defense, the White House, to intervene in Iraq with the Iraq War, do you really think that this theory, democratic peace theory, was important for the decision? And to what extent do you think that was a miscalculation, or from the very beginning they really didn't believe in their own theory, in their own strategy?
So democratic peace theory was absolutely fundamental to the way in which the George W. Bush administration constructed the freedom agenda. It's consistently referenced as in, like, and directly, that democracies don't, why do we want to do this? Because democracies don't go to war together. But you're right in the sense of, whereas Japan and Germany had middle classes, the middle classes in the Middle East have been seen differently. And that is to say that the middle class exists, but it is within the political economy of the Middle East, they are seen to exist at the behest of the state. So because of the way the state economies operate, the middle classes are created and dependent on the state rather than being independent themselves. And so when they were talking about modernization thesis, they were trying to arrive at the point of democratic peace, if you like, long-term through slow incremental reforms. It was Colin Powell that was asked this question, are you abandoning your allies? No, we're not. This is about slow incremental reforms over time to create democratic peace. But this idea was that actually the middle class needs to be strengthened, it needs to become independent within those countries, and you would do that through modernization.
Okay. If I may, second question. On Europe, actually two questions. The first one is on Karim, he said before that Brussels was an actor, and this is, the European Union as a whole. And there is a European Union agenda for neighborhood, for the vicinity. The neighborhood policy is officially named the European Neighborhood Policy, and we have also this Union for Mediterranean Organization. And well, it is some kind of a strategy from the European Commission and the European External Action Service. But we know that the European Union, we have different member states. Now we have 27, no longer 28. And it's particularly interesting because the European external action is very complex. It's very difficult to have a common position. But in particular, when dealing with Middle East, it's one of the regions in which it's more complex, more difficult. Why? Because basically you have, on the one hand, France and other countries, other member states such as Spain. On the other hand, you have Germany and other member states, normally Eastern UK, until withdrawal, until Brexit. One of them supporting Israel positions in the region, Germany, UK, Italy to some extent, and France, Spain, and other supporting in the Middle East conflict of the Palestinian position. So the point is, to what extent is even possible to think about a European Union policy towards the region when the two most important member states don't agree about the fundamental architecture of the region? And a second question is connected to Donald Trump on Iran, on the Iran deal. And for the first time, it's very explicit, very obvious that the strategy of the US and the rest of Europe in the region is absolutely different. It's true that in the Iraq war, we have also differences. But in the Iraq war, basically what happened was that the European Union itself was divided, with some member states, such as UK or Spain, supporting Iraq war, and others, such as Germany and France, against, and the European institutions. But now what we have is a division, a transatlantic division, US on the one hand, Europe on the other. So it is really makes a difference. There is some kind of transatlantic agenda on the region regarding democratization.
Okay. So if I take your first question,
the first one is the division within Europe, and the second one is the division within the transatlantic partnership.
No, I think that's right. Whenever you're talking about the European Union, there's a tendency, and I slip into it, to talk of it and give it a certain actorness that is more concrete than it is. And I think in part that's because we can see that actorness as an emergent product of what is effectively a complex adaptive system. So I think it's legitimate to sort of talk about it in that way. However, what's emerging is usually the lowest common denominator of agreement, which is why I think fundamentally when we look at EU actorness, does the actorness exist? Yes, it does. what is the nature of that actorness? Well, it's usually the lowest common denominator agreement that you can get through the institutions themselves. So do I buy into this idea of supranationalism that people like Ben Rosman would talk about? In part, yes, because I think that it does in certain areas exhibit that. But of course, when it comes to foreign policy, that's probably the area where it's least effective because there's the most disagreement with it. Certainly when it comes to the Middle East, let's be like you point out. And I think you're right. I mean, I can't remember a level of tensions. Well, I've never seen in my lifetime a period where the United States is actively trying to undermine its European allies, not by sort of saying, right, we have disagreements, by actively trying to undermine the institutions themselves, whether that be, by sort of saying that, NATO needs to step up and pay more, what use is NATO, or whether it being, yes, Britain should leave the European Union, won't that be wonderful for Britain? But by the way, we're not going to give you a free trade deal. So, this is an unusual moment. And it comes from, in my mind, it comes from this sense of decline, or American decline, that the Trump administration was able to really promote, able to sort of say, like, look, let's make America great again, because the United States is fundamentally losing in all of these roles that it's sort of traditionally had. Now, that really seemed to resonate with the American voting public. And so what we now have is America First, that quite actively wants to undermine the liberal international order in favour of whatever Donald Trump seems to think fits American interests on that day. And that's real problematic.
I had a question, Oz, regarding you mentioned that transition from democracy promotion to economic liberalization within the U.S. administration that took place during the Bush years. So I was wondering, it seemed that from what I understood, it was very or quite sudden as opposed to something gradual. And I was wondering if there was something specifically that triggered that change, or a unit within the administration, or the State Department versus Defense, or what actually was the cause of this shift. And then you mentioned something about new technologies undermining the sort of like Arab uprisings, or the indigenous will to open up the system. So I was wondering what kind of new technologies were you thinking of? Is it like surveillance, or how? What are those? Thanks.
Okay. So in terms of economic liberalisation, the idea, it was a case of the United States had 4 pillars to its MEPI programming. So it had a political pillar, an economic pillar, a women's rights pillar, and an education pillar. And what you saw from 2006, and I think the real trigger was the successful election with Hamas. That I think it's in Condoleezza Rice's memoirs that there's this, or no, it might be in a Bob Wood book, but there's this moment where she was running on a treadmill and she hears the election that Hamas have won, and she can't believe it. Which sort of, in many ways, sort of tells you how out of step the United States was. That it just fundamentally didn't believe that Islamists could win elections because everyone wanted democracy, and obviously that meant the liberal parties would win. It's quite naive, but that was certainly the sort of posture that they sort of adopted. So 2006, what you saw was that those 3 other pillars begin to withdraw as the economic pillar began to dominate. And in many ways, it's very easy to sort of get people to sign up to the economic pillar because it's in everyone's interest. It's in American businesses' interest to say, would you like a free market where you can go and sell your goods over there? Yes. For the Egyptians, Mubarak had been liberalising Egypt, and I think at that point it was said by the time the revolution actually came around, the Egyptian economy was more privatized than state-owned. I'm not necessarily sure I believe that, but I believe that is the sort of one of the things that sort of went around. I mean, because of course we don't actually know exactly what the Egyptian army owns, so it's always slightly tricky. You know, do they own that tank? Do they own that pot-making plant? They certainly own the hotels. I mean, that was part of what the revolution was about. So it's interesting to sort of see how far they've come and what an easy sell free trade agreements were. Mainly, you know, well, I'll sort of leave there for that. But if we sort of talk about the technology, what we're beginning to see now, and we've begun to see it really for like, I'd say the last 10 years, is that increasingly the modern technology that you have on you with a smartphone and technology around you is being used for state surveillance to prop up authoritarianism. And the Saudis, for example, are very, very keen on this. So Saudi Arabia, under Mohammed bin Salman, has got the Vision 2030 strategy. They're pumping $500 billion in creating Neom, which is a city out in the desert. They're building it from scratch. Now, artificial intelligence that they are basically getting from China and growing indigenously is being imported into that. So what that technology does, of course, is it has facial recognition. It can track where you are, what you are doing. And we are seeing that the ability for autocratic states to now manage populations automatically instead of relying on, you know, politburos, if you like, is now at a tipping point where it is now possible. And it's not just possible, it's being undertaken. And I think that that's a real tipping point in terms of freedom and democracy in the future, because that technology will enable autocratic regimes to withstand themselves. It's certainly what China's adopting, why China is adopting it in certain parts of China to control populations there, certainly Muslim populations as well. So we're beginning to see this kind of dangerous moment where we had this moment where we thought, you know, people like Larry Diamond were talking about democracy and sort of, you know, freedom technology, that this is liberating technology, and technology, you know, because we can all communicate with each other, was wonderful. Then we had, like, you know, the Arab Spring, which used some of that technology in part with other technologies and more and other ways on the ground. But we are now seeing regimes as a tipping point using that technology to control populations again. And that's quite frightening.
Let me ask you not about the Middle East, so I don't know if you have an answer or not, but there are 2-3 countries in Europe, apart from Turkey, with important Muslim majority. They are not Arabs in the Western Balkans. I'm talking about Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Albania. But in particular, in Kosovo, it's very interesting that the U.S. foreign policy is very much in favor of promoting statehood of Kosovo, state building. It's absolutely promoting recognition for the rest of the international community. And well, sometimes the Americans are doing that basically because of the Russians supporting the Serbs, and it's very connected to the diplomacy with Russia. But there are also in the U.S. foreign policy the idea that supporting a Muslim country such as Kosovo is connected to the idea that the U.S. foreign policy is not anti-Muslim, and that when you are promoting and you are supporting with your diplomacy and also with your involvement of the American army on the ground in Kosovo, is to show that your commitment to the idea of promoting the creation of a stable state and democracy with, in this case, it's not Arab, it's not Middle East, but it's a Muslim country. It is to some extent connected to the idea of democratization in the Middle East. I don't know if you agree or not with that, or do you think there is a connection, there is a link between this explicit supporting foreign policy on Kosovo?
Yeah, I think I'm not going to pretend that for a moment that I would have a definitive answer to that or know enough to sort of go into it. But what I would say is this, is that, you know, does race and religion feature as an element of US foreign policy?
Exactly.
Absolutely it does. Does raw power probably feature more? I would say yeah. And raw geopolitical power balancing American interests against having anyone sort of be able to prevent the United States and the American project being around would probably take precedent over any issues of race and religion per se.
Okay, okay, we have questions.